HR told me I was too emotional to lead the biggest compliance project our company had touched in 5 years, exactly 19 minutes after I watched my replacement walk into the conference room carrying the presentation I built myself. Nobody looked directly at me when Dana from Human Resources slid the printed performance memo across the table, mostly because everyone already knew the decision had been made before the meeting even started. My replacement, Ethan, had been at the company for 11 weeks, wore expensive Navy suits like armor, and liked repeating my ideas back to executives in a deeper voice. I remember noticing the exact time on the glass wall clock behind them, 9:14 a.m., because that was the moment I realized the humiliation had been carefully staged. The VP kept using words like stability, leadership temperament, and executive presence while avoiding the real issue. The federal healthcare contract I designed was about to enter external review, and they wanted someone easier to blame if something went wrong. I nodded, thanked them for the feedback, and quietly handed over my access badge for the project folders. What nobody in that room understood was that the audit request had already been filed 48 hours earlier under my name. I was 28 years old, worked 12-hour days in a gray Chicago office overlooking the river, and spent 3 straight years building a reputation for fixing problems executives preferred to hide behind polished quarterly reports. The compliance division wasn't glamorous, but it controlled everything people higher up desperately wanted ignored: billing irregularities, contractor payments, missing approval trails, reimbursement discrepancies buried inside spreadsheets nobody read carefully until regulators started asking questions. I learned early that calm women in corporate environments are often mistaken for weak women, so I stopped correcting people when they underestimated me. Ethan became Vice President Mark Ellison's favorite almost immediately because he knew how to sound confident in meetings without actually saying anything specific, and HR adored him because he looked clean, agreeable, and easy to market in leadership photos. Meanwhile, I became difficult the second I documented concerns about duplicated vendor charges tied to our federal healthcare expansion project. 2 days before I was removed, I sent Mark a formal email recommending a temporary pause on implementation until the discrepancies were reviewed. He never responded directly. Instead, HR invited me into conference room C on a rainy Tuesday morning and explained, with rehearsed sympathy, that leadership needed someone less emotionally reactive, guiding the project into federal review. The strange thing about public humiliation is that the room usually becomes quieter afterward, almost like people are waiting to see whether you'll collapse fast enough to justify what they just watched. By noon, half the office already knew I'd been removed from the healthcare compliance project, even though HR promised the transition would remain confidential. My Slack notifications stopped almost completely after lunch except for 2 messages. One from payroll asking me to confirm my remaining PTO balance, and another from my coworker Vanessa that simply said, "Check your email archives before they lock you out." I read that message 3 times. At 2:07 p.m., Ethan scheduled a mandatory department meeting where he stood beside the projector screen using my implementation roadmap, while speaking like he'd personally built the system from scratch. "We're moving toward a cleaner, more collaborative leadership model," he said while avoiding eye contact with me entirely. Then he smiled at the executives seated along the glass wall and added, "Sometimes projects suffer when emotion overrides structure." Nobody defended me. Not even Vanessa. I sat there taking notes anyway because emotional people react publicly and dangerous people document everything quietly. At 4:42 p.m., my company laptop received an automated permissions notice showing Ethan had been granted master approval authority over the federal reimbursement accounts tied to the project. That detail mattered because I'd spent 6 months fighting to keep dual verification safeguards active after discovering irregular vendor approvals connected to a consulting firm called Norvale Strategies. The company billed us nearly $480,000 in regulatory advisory services, despite having no listed employees on several federal contractor databases. I raised the concern twice internally. Both times Mark Ellison told me to stop looking for problems that slow momentum. That night, instead of going home immediately, I sat in my car inside the parking garage and opened the archive folder Vanessa warned me about. Buried inside old reimbursement threads was a chain forwarded accidentally by one of Mark's assistants 3 weeks earlier. The subject line read, "Need temporary override before review." Ethan's name appeared 6 separate times. So did Norvale Strategies. One message from Mark stood out enough that I took screenshots immediately. Once Ethan takes point, we'll finally stop getting buried in unnecessary compliance escalation. My chest tightened reading it, not because I was shocked but because the timeline suddenly made sense. They didn't remove me because I was emotional. They removed me because I documented too much. At 8:16 p.m., I forwarded the entire archive to my personal legal folder along with timestamps, approval histories, and reimbursement discrepancies I'd already been tracking independently for months. Then I opened the federal reporting portal I bookmarked weeks earlier but never submitted through. Filing an official audit request against your own employer feels strangely clinical. The form asked for supporting evidence, involved departments, contract numbers, and estimated exposure amounts. I attached 37 files. Before submitting, I stared at the final confirmation page while rain hammered against the windshield hard enough to blur the parking structure lights outside my car. I remember thinking about the phrase HR used earlier that morning: leadership temperament. Then I clicked submit at exactly 8:31 p.m. The next morning, Ethan arrived carrying designer coffee for executives, while people congratulated him near the elevators. Around noon, he walked directly to my desk and lowered his voice enough to sound sympathetic. "I know yesterday probably felt personal," he said, adjusting the cufflinks on his navy shirt. "But leadership just needed someone steadier under pressure." I smiled politely and thanked him for the feedback while my phone vibrated silently inside my desk drawer. The notification came from the Federal Oversight Portal, confirming receipt of my whistleblower submission and assigning an active case number. Ethan kept talking for another minute without realizing the project he fought to take over now officially belonged to federal investigators too. The federal acknowledgement email arrived Thursday morning at 6:12 a.m., while I was standing in my kitchen making coffee, and the subject line alone changed the entire emotional temperature of my week. Request for preliminary documentation review. They wanted additional supporting records within 72 hours, including approval chains, vendor authorization logs, and internal correspondence tied to the healthcare expansion contract. I forwarded the message to the attorney Vanessa quietly recommended 2 years earlier after a separate compliance dispute nearly cost another manager his career. Her name was Rebecca Klein, and the first thing she said during our phone consultation that afternoon was, "You documented this far too carefully for someone they called emotional." By Friday, the office atmosphere had shifted in subtle but unmistakable ways. Executives started closing conference room doors during conversations. Ethan stopped making theatrical leadership speeches near the department floor. IT disabled external printing permissions without explanation. Even the receptionist noticed something was wrong after 2 men wearing dark federal contractor badges arrived unannounced asking for procurement records. Nobody used the word investigation publicly yet, but panic has a specific rhythm inside corporate environments. It starts with silence, then sudden calendar changes, then executives pretending they've always supported transparency. At 11:04 a.m., Mark Ellison sent a company-wide email praising the organization's ongoing commitment to accountability and procedural excellence. 20 minutes later, Vanessa forwarded me a screenshot showing him yelling at Ethan inside conference room B through the glass walls. Apparently the investigators requested approval signatures tied directly to Norvale Strategies, and Ethan's digital authorization appeared on payments approved before his official promotion date even began. That detail mattered because it suggested someone granted him unauthorized system access, while I still technically controlled compliance oversight. Around 3:30 p.m., HR suddenly scheduled a wellness check-in meeting with me. Dana greeted me with the same rehearsed sympathy she used during my removal meeting, except this time her hands trembled slightly while arranging papers on the table. "We want to ensure you feel supported during organizational stress," she said carefully. I almost laughed. 2 weeks earlier they questioned my emotional stability in front of senior leadership, and now they wanted documentation showing they cared about employee well-being during a federal inquiry. Dana eventually slid a confidentiality agreement toward me and suggested it might be best for everyone if I avoided discussing internal processes externally while the review remained active. I read the entire document slowly before asking one simple question. Did legal approve this language after the investigators arrived or before? She didn't answer directly. Instead, she said, "You need to understand how serious this situation could become." I looked at her for a long moment before replying calmly. I understood that before HR removed me from the project. The meeting ended 12 minutes later. That evening, Rebecca called me while I sat in traffic outside downtown Chicago. "Do not sign anything," she said immediately, "and forward me every communication HR sends from this point forward." Then her tone shifted slightly. "Also, someone from the Office of Inspector General may contact you directly next week." I tightened my grip on the steering wheel hearing that. Federal audits sound abstract until agencies with actual enforcement power begin requesting interviews by name. Monday morning started with rumors spreading faster than official information. Employees whispered near coffee stations about frozen accounts and missing reimbursement files while executives disappeared into emergency meetings on the 32nd floor. Around noon, Ethan attempted damage control by hosting another department briefing. He wore a charcoal suit this time instead of navy, but his confidence looked thinner now, stretched tightly over visible panic. "There's been some routine federal procedural interest," he told the room, speaking too quickly. "Nothing unusual for projects of this size." Then someone near the back asked why external investigators requested 6 months of payment records overnight. Ethan froze for half a second before recovering with a corporate smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Standard transparency protocols," he answered. The room stayed silent afterward until his phone vibrated loudly against the conference table. He glanced down at the screen, and all the color disappeared from his face immediately. Then he stood up without explanation and walked out while the call was still ringing. By Tuesday morning, the entire office knew something catastrophic had happened during that phone call, even though nobody said it directly. Ethan didn't return to work that afternoon, and his executive access card stopped functioning before sunset. I only knew because Vanessa texted me a blurry photo from the lobby showing him standing beside security holding a leather briefcase while arguing quietly with 2 IT administrators near the elevators. "This is getting bad," she wrote underneath the image. She was wrong. It was already bad. What people didn't know yet was that the investigators had started comparing vendor payment timestamps against internal login records, and the discrepancies were widening by the hour. Rebecca called me that evening after receiving partial discovery materials through federal counsel. "Your documentation created a timeline they can actually prosecute from," she said carefully. "That almost never happens this early." Then she paused before adding, "Mark Ellison's name appears on more approvals than we expected." Wednesday started with emergency restructuring rumors spreading across every department floor. Senior leadership canceled quarterly planning meetings, legal representatives occupied 3 executive conference rooms, and HR suddenly stopped answering questions about staffing changes entirely. Around 10:15 a.m., I received an official request to attend a federal interview at a downtown oversight office the following Monday. The email instructed me to preserve all communication records and avoid discussing investigative details with current company leadership. 30 minutes later, Dana from HR approached my desk looking physically exhausted. Her makeup couldn't fully hide the dark circles under her eyes anymore. "Can we talk privately?" she asked quietly. We sat inside the same conference room where they removed me from the project 2 weeks earlier, except this time she avoided scripted corporate language completely. "They're reviewing all personnel decisions connected to the compliance division," she admitted while folding her hands tightly together. "Including your reassignment." I nodded without responding. Dana swallowed hard before continuing. "Legal believes there may have been pressure to remove employees who raised concerns about reimbursement approvals." The sentence hung in the room for several seconds. Hearing HR indirectly acknowledge retaliation should have felt satisfying, but mostly it felt late. "Did Mark tell you I was unstable?" I asked calmly. Dana looked down immediately, which answered the question faster than words could. Then she said something that stayed with me long afterward. "He said you were becoming dangerous to operational momentum." Dangerous. Not emotional. Not difficult. Dangerous. Because I kept records. Because I noticed patterns. Because I refused to sign approvals without documentation trails attached. By Thursday, local business reporters started calling the corporate office requesting comments about federal healthcare reimbursement irregularities connected to unnamed contractors. Employees pretended to work while secretly refreshing news feeds under their desks. Around noon, Compliance officers entered the executive floor carrying sealed document boxes while two outside attorneys followed closely behind them. Nobody even tried hiding the panic anymore. Then, at 1:42 p.m., the company scheduled a mandatory all-staff meeting. Over 400 employees packed into the auditorium, while executives sat rigidly near the stage looking like people waiting for medical test results. Mark Ellison walked to the podium first, but his usual polished confidence was gone completely. His tie sat crooked against his collar, and his voice cracked slightly during the opening statement about temporary operational disruptions. Then the general counsel interrupted him mid-sentence and quietly asked him to step aside. You could feel the tension shift instantly. The attorney adjusted the microphone and announced that several employees, including senior leadership members, had been placed on administrative leave pending federal review into procurement authorization procedures. Somebody near the back gasped when Mark's name appeared on the overhead presentation slide. Then came Ethan's name directly underneath it. The room erupted into whispers. Mark looked stunned, genuinely stunned, like he believed corporate loyalty would somehow protect him from documentation carrying his own signature. But the moment that changed everything happened next. The general counsel cleared his throat and announced that interim leadership over the healthcare compliance reconstruction project would be assigned effective immediately due to prior documented procedural accuracy under difficult circumstances. Then my name appeared on the screen behind him in large white letters, while 400 employees turned around to look directly at me. Nobody clapped when my name appeared on the auditorium screen. That was the part one remembered most afterward. The room stayed completely silent because people weren't reacting to a promotion. They were reacting to a power shift they suddenly realized had been building quietly in front of them for months. I stood slowly while executives avoided eye contact and employees who ignored me for weeks stared like they were recalculating every conversation we'd ever had. The general counsel motioned for me to join him near the stage, and as I walked down the aisle, I noticed Mark sitting rigidly in the front row with both hands locked together so tightly his knuckles looked pale under the auditorium lights. Ethan's chair beside him was empty. Later I learned federal investigators collected his company laptop from his apartment at 6:20 that morning. The attorney handed me a temporary leadership packet and spoke carefully into the microphone. Ms. Bennett previously documented concerns regarding vendor authorization procedures and reimbursement irregularities connected to the federal healthcare expansion initiative. Hearing my concerns publicly validated after weeks of quiet humiliation felt strangely unemotional at first, almost clinical. Then the attorney added one final sentence. Her reporting materially contributed to the organization identifying internal control failures before broader federal exposure escalated. That was corporate language for she tried to warn us before this became a disaster. By evening, national healthcare compliance blogs published articles about the investigation, and anonymous employees started leaking internal details online faster than legal teams could contain them. Someone uploaded screenshots of executive emails discussing containment strategy around reimbursement approvals. Another leak exposed Norvale Strategies as a shell consulting company connected indirectly to Mark Ellison's college roommate through two separate holding groups registered in Delaware. The amount under review eventually climbed above $11 million. Suddenly the woman HR labeled emotionally reactive became the only person regulators trusted to stabilize the compliance division before contract suspension proceedings began. The next week turned surreal. Federal auditors occupied entire conference floors. Outside counsel walked through hallways carrying sealed evidence binders. Executives who once ignored my recommendations now requested private meetings asking for procedural guidance with carefully controlled politeness. Even Dana from HR changed completely. During one late evening meeting, she quietly admitted the leadership team pressured human resources to build a performance-based narrative, supporting my removal after I refused accelerated vendor approvals. They needed documentation protecting executive decisions, she said softly while staring at the conference table. And they knew you wouldn't stop escalating concerns. I appreciated the honesty, even if it arrived too late to matter emotionally. The real ending came 11 days later during a federal review session inside the same glass conference room where Ethan first called me unstable under pressure. Two investigators sat across from me reviewing reconstructed payment chains, while Rebecca organized legal folders beside my laptop. Around halfway through the meeting, One investigator looked up from the documents and asked, "When did you first realize leadership intended to remove you from oversight?" I answered honestly, "The moment they started questioning my temperament instead of the numbers." The investigator nodded slowly like he'd heard that pattern before. After the meeting ended, I stayed behind alone for a few minutes looking out across the Chicago skyline while rain moved softly against the windows exactly the way it had the night I filed the audit request from my car. My phone buzzed once before I left the building. It was an internal company announcement confirming Mark Ellison's formal resignation effective immediately. No farewell statement. No leadership tribute. Just a date and a signature from legal counsel. I stared at the message for several seconds before locking my phone and walking toward the elevators. Months earlier, they positioned me as an emotional liability to protect people gambling millions on the assumption I would stay quiet under humiliation. What they never understood was that calm women don't always retreat when cornered. Sometimes they document everything, wait patiently, and let the truth arrive carrying federal credentials. 3 months later, the company settled part of the federal investigation under sealed oversight conditions. Norvale Strategies disappeared from every vendor registry connected to the project, and the executives who spent years protecting each other suddenly stopped returning one another's calls. People inside the office treated me differently after that, but not because of the title printed beside my name now. It was because they finally understood something I learned long ago. Calm is not weakness and silence is not surrender. The same employees who once watched me get removed from the project without saying a word now lowered their voices when I entered meetings, carefully reading every document before sliding it across the table. Dana eventually resigned from HR. Ethan vanished from corporate healthcare entirely. And Mark's resignation became one more polished statement buried under legal language nobody fully believed. Sometimes I still think about that conference room and the moment they called me too emotional to lead. They thought composure meant compliance. They thought humiliation would make me smaller. Instead, it made them careless. Because the people most confident in their power rarely notice the quiet woman documenting the collapse before it begins. If you've ever stayed silent while people underestimated you, subscribe. Because some stories deserve to be heard all the way to the end.